Between June 22nd and June 28th of this year, Europe lived through 7 days that climate scientists studying the event have since described in stark, unambiguous terms the most severe heat wave ever recorded across the region they examined. Official mortality monitoring has already confirmed more than 10,000 excess deaths during that single week alone, with more than 9,000 of those deaths among people aged 65 and older, according to Euromomo, the European Mortality Monitoring Network backed by the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control and the World Health Organization. One preliminary academic estimate, built using a well-established statistical method but not yet peer-reviewed, puts the true toll considerably higher still, at more than 20,000 deaths in that single week across the continent. Southern Europe has borne a disproportionate share of that burden for 3 consecutive years running, and researchers studying the region's heat mortality say the underlying trend line has never pointed this steeply upward before. This is the story of exactly how deadly this specific stretch of European heat actually was, why scientists are confident in calling it unprecedented even, while the final confirmed death toll remains months away from being fully known, and why Southern Europe specifically keeps absorbing the worst of it year after year. No exaggeration, just what Euromomo, the World Weather Attribution Group, and the researchers actually studying this data are reporting. Drop a comment and tell me if you or anyone you know lived through this specific heat wave in Southern Europe, because the researchers behind this data say the scale of what just happened has genuinely not been seen before in the modern record. And first-hand accounts like yours are exactly the kind of detail that gets lost once a story gets reduced to a single large number. I read every one of these. If you want grounded coverage instead of recycled panic, subscribe. It is free. And a like helps this reach people who need accurate information about a risk that keeps returning to the same region every summer. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Now let us get into it. To understand why scientists can confidently call this heat wave unprecedented, while simultaneously admitting they do not yet know the exact final death toll, you first need to understand how heat mortality is actually measured, because it works considerably differently from counting deaths after a storm or a fire. When someone dies during a hurricane or a collapsed building, that death is usually attributed directly and immediately. Heat rarely kills that cleanly. Instead, it strains the cardiovascular system, worsens existing respiratory and kidney conditions, and pushes people who were already frail toward a death that might be recorded on paper as a heart attack or organ failure rather than heat itself. Because of that, researchers rely on a method called excess mortality, comparing how many people actually died during a given week against how many would typically be expected to die during that same week based on recent historical averages, with the gap between those two numbers representing the death toll heat likely caused, even when heat is never written on any individual death certificate. That method is why Euromomo's confirmed figure of more than 10,000 excess deaths already carries real statistical weight, even though it will still take additional months of data collection before researchers can finalize precisely how many of those deaths trace back to this specific heat wave with full confidence. This lag between an event happening and its true toll becoming known is not a flaw in the science. It is a deliberate feature of how excess mortality analysis works, since researchers need enough subsequent weeks of ordinary mortality data to confidently establish what the baseline should have looked like without the heat wave's influence at all. A comparison that simply cannot be rushed without sacrificing the accuracy the method is specifically designed to protect. The preliminary academic estimate, putting the toll even higher, comes from Christopher O. Callahan, an assistant professor at Indiana University Bloomington, who used temperature and mortality correlation data across Europe to estimate that the heat wave killed approximately 20,390 people between June 22nd and 28th, including roughly 5,210 in France, 3,163 in Spain, and 862 in the United Kingdom. Callahan has been explicit that his analysis has not yet been peer-reviewed and that the numbers remain preliminary, but he has also argued that the estimate highlights the accelerating threat of mass heat mortality events across Europe, despite years of adaptation efforts. That preliminary figure sits meaningfully above Euromomo's own confirmed tally, a gap that official mortality monitoring network working with confirmed data and an independent academic model built to estimate a fuller picture faster than official channels typically can. The World Weather Attribution Group, an international collaboration of climate scientists who specialize in rapidly analyzing whether a specific extreme weather event was made more likely by climate change, concluded that this particular heat wave was the most severe ever recorded across the specific region they studied, and separately determined that a heat wave this intense would have been virtually impossible without the warming humans have already caused. Temperature records fell like dominoes across at least 13 countries during the event, including Austria, Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom, with France recording its hottest day in national history only one day after breaking that same record the previous day. In Spain, mortality. Monitoring data reported more than 200 heat-related deaths over just 4 days at the peak of the event, while French officials confirmed at least 55 drowning deaths as people sought relief from the heat in rivers, lakes, and coastal waters, deaths that would not typically be classified as heat deaths in official statistics, despite occurring directly because of the extreme temperatures driving people into the water in the first place. The heat also disrupted infrastructure well beyond its direct toll on human health, with roads softening and buckling under the sustained temperatures, tram and railway tracks warping badly enough to force widespread service disruptions, and thousands of schools across the affected children to sit through classes in buildings with no meaningful cooling system at all. Here is where the story moves from describing one severe week to explaining why Southern Europe specifically keeps absorbing the worst of this pattern year after year, rather than the burden shifting around the continent randomly. Researchers at the Barcelona Institute for Global Health, known as IS Global, have tracked European heat mortality across multiple recent summers using daily mortality records from more than 30 countries, and their data consistently shows that roughly 2/3 of all heat-related deaths across the EU continent occur specifically in Southern Europe. Italy in particular has recorded the highest absolute heat death toll of any European country in each of the past several summers studied, a pattern researchers attribute directly to the country having proportionally the largest elderly population in Europe, combined with housing stock that, like much of Southern Europe, was built decades before extreme heat waves like this one became a regular seasonal occurrence. Tomas Llanos, the lead author of IS Global's most recent annual mortality study, described the significance of these repeated findings plainly, saying the consistency of these numbers is telling researchers that European populations need to begin genuinely adapting rather than treating each severe summer as an isolated anomaly. It is worth placing this June heat wave within the broader trend researchers have been documenting year over year, because the pattern extends well beyond any single event. The summer of 2022 remains the deadliest European heat season. Researchers have fully analyzed to date with a detailed daily mortality analysis, eventually confirming just over 70,000 deaths once all the data had been collected. 2023's toll came in somewhat lower at just under 50,000 confirmed deaths, while 2024's toll rose again to more than 62,700, a 23% increase in the summer mortality rate compared to the year before it, according to research published in the journal Nature Medicine. Joan Ballester-Clairemont of the Barcelona Institute for Global Health, the lead author of the 2022 mortality analysis, made a point that has only grown more relevant with each subsequent summer, arguing that these death tolls are not freak, one-off occurrences, but outcomes that, given how clearly the underlying warming trend has been documented, could reasonably have been predicted in advance. It is worth being precise about what remains genuinely uncertain in this specific case, because responsible reporting on a still unfolding mortality count requires resisting the temptation to present a preliminary estimate as a final, confirmed number. Callahan's own 20,000 figure is explicitly not yet peer-reviewed, and Euromomo's own confirmed 10,000 figure is itself likely to rise as additional weeks of mortality data continue being processed and compared against seasonal baselines, a pattern that has repeated with essentially every major European heatwave researchers have studied in recent years, since the fullest, most reliable death toll estimates for events like this one have consistently taken researchers several additional months to finalize with confidence. Reasonable people can look at these two different figures, the confirmed 10,000 and the preliminary 20,000, and reach different conclusions about which one to cite, depending on whether they prioritize official certainty or a fuller, faster picture of the likely true scale. And both approaches carry genuine scientific merit rather than one simply being right and the other wrong. What is not preliminary or uncertain is the World Weather Attribution Group's core conclusion that this specific heatwave's severity was made dramatically more likely by human-caused climate change, a finding built on established peer-reviewed attribution methodology rather than the more time-sensitive mortality modeling still being finalized. World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus underscored why this pattern deserves sustained attention rather than treating each summer's heat wave as a standalone news event, stating plainly that Europe is warming at roughly twice the global average rate, making it the fastest warming continent on Earth. That accelerated warming trend is precisely why researchers studying this issue describe the current situation as an infrastructure and public health mismatch, rather than simply an unusually hot summer, since most of Southern Europe's housing and public infrastructure, including its rail systems, road surfaces, and residential buildings, was designed decades ago around a climate that reliably no longer describes the summers the region actually experiences now. So what does all of this actually mean if you live anywhere across Southern Europe, or have elderly relatives who do. The practical lesson is that the population most at risk during any future heat wave is overwhelmingly the same group researchers keep identifying in study after study: people aged 65 and older, meaning checking on elderly relatives and neighbors during any period of extreme heat is not a general kindness, but a specific, evidence-based intervention shown repeatedly to matter for this exact outcome. Keep at least one room in your home genuinely cool during any heat warning. Stay hydrated steadily throughout the day rather than only when thirsty. Avoid direct sun and strenuous outdoor activity during peak afternoon hours. And take any officially issued heat health warning as seriously as you would a warning for any other kind of severe weather, since the data consistently shows heat killing far more people across Europe each year than storms, floods, or wildfires combined, despite receiving considerably less sustained public attention than those more visually dramatic hazards typically do. The honest, grounded summary is this: Europe's late June heatwave has been formally identified by the World Weather Attribution Group as the most severe heat event ever recorded across the region studied, with Euromomo's official mortality monitoring already confirming more than 10,000 excess deaths during that single week, the overwhelming majority among people 65 and older, while a preliminary, not yet peer-reviewed academic estimate puts the true toll as high as 20,390. Southern Europe has absorbed roughly 2/3 of all heat-related deaths across the continent in each of the past several years studied, with Italy recording the highest absolute toll of any European country repeatedly, a pattern researchers link directly to the region's older population and aging infrastructure. That toll fits within a broader, well-documented trend, with confirmed European heat deaths reaching roughly 70,000 in 2022, just under 50,000 in 2023, and more than 62,700 in 2024. Evidence researchers say shows this is an accelerating, predictable pattern rather than a series of unconnected, unlucky summers. We are going to keep tracking this exact story the way we tracked it today, straight from Euromomo, the World Weather Attribution Group, and the researchers at the Barcelona Institute for Global Health actually studying this data, not recycled headlines built on a single preliminary number. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Once the confirmed final toll for this specific heat wave is eventually published, because based on how long that process has taken for every comparable European heat wave in recent years, that number is still months away from being fully settled. And leave that comment below. Tell me if learning how consistently Southern Europe absorbs the worst of this pattern changes how you think about visiting or living in the region during peak summer months, because that regional concentration is exactly the part of this story that tends to get lost once a single large continent-wide death toll becomes the headline. Because behind every one of these excess mortality statistics is an elderly woman in an unair-conditioned apartment in Rome who never called for help because she did not realize how much danger she was actually in. A funeral home in Paris that became overwhelmed, handling far more cases than a normal June ever produces. And a researcher in Indiana still refining a preliminary number that, however it is eventually finalized, will not change how many families across Southern Europe are already living with the loss this 1 week of heat has already caused. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.